Welcome back to Young Heretics. You guys, we have got to talk about Neuralink. Why, you may ask, do we have to talk about Neuralink? Well, first of all, everybody seems to be talking about it, and I think this kind of stuff is not going away. You've probably seen some of the videos around this stuff. You probably know what I'm talking about. This is Elon Musk's company, which creates brain-to-computer interfaces, or is trying to create a workable brain-to-computer interface. One of these things that's always tossing up these incredibly dystopian clips right out of sci-fi novels, and we start to wonder whether this is maybe more than just a fad, whether we're looking at the first scene in the Terminator movie or the harbinger of some kind of apocalypse. When that kind of thing starts to happen, when the temperature starts to rise, when the stress of the debate and the timeline starts to feel completely overwhelming and everything feels radically new, radically unsettling, unprecedented, that is precisely the moment for the Young Heretics bat signal to go up in the air and for us to swoop in with some insight from the longer view of history and the Western tradition and the Western canon. The theme, a major theme of this show, is anytime something looks like it's going to take us into a totally brave new world, detach us utterly from everything that has gone before, and fix us in this eternal present where everything is 5 minutes ago and clipped off of the Twitter timeline and maximum volume and maximum stress, that is the moment to step back, as Machiavelli would advise, put on your courtly garments, enter into the retreat of the study and the secret society of great minds that is trans-chronological, that extends across time and space and generations, and to ask what's really going on here and what parts of this are actually new and what parts of this are eternal and touch upon actually central matters of human nature that have always been around, that have been thought about before, that have been dealt with in supremely sophisticated intellectual ways that we can take advantage of. We are not alone. We are not comfortless. We are not without resources. We have a whole centuries and centuries worth of history to dig into and of intellectual wisdom to refer back to when something like this touches upon our deepest and rawest human emotions, which something like Neuralink does. It raises questions that touch on the most tender parts of us, the parts that are even difficult to describe, the soul and our place in the universe and our relationship to God and reality. And that's, of course, why the temperature is so high. That's why these clips raise so much alarm, but it's also why it's crucial to keep one hold on our tradition, even as we look forward into the future. So this is exactly the kind of thing that Young Heretics exists to address in some ways. And I've been saying this year that I want to talk about art and morality, and I've been doing a lot of that. And I've also been saying I want to talk about science and faith, science and religion. And I haven't been doing as much of that, although I do have a new book coming out about it in August. So I'm going to start talking more about this stuff, building up to it. The book is called Light of the Mind, Light of the World. You can pre-order that now. I'll put a link in the description of this episode. But we don't have to wait for that book to start thinking through some of these issues because the technology is not going to wait. We live in a technological age of rapid acceleration. We are constantly waiting for the next big thing that's going to transform and upend the world. And we can't even really tell if it's already underway and it's already too late to think and talk about. And Neuralink is one of those things. You know, Elon Musk is this major world historical figure, or at least he's poised to potentially become one. If you are interested in him, I highly recommend to you Walter Isaacson's biography of the guy, which I just finished recently. It's a good way, I think, to kind of step out of the current controversy over like Twitter and all of the politics of it, and to think instead about what makes the man himself tick, what he's trying to do. And one takeaway that I got from that is Musk genuinely behaves in an ideals-driven way. And the question is not whether he's sincere. The question is whether his sincerely held ideals are virtuous or vicious or deficient or what, or need correction. My general impression is that this is a person of goodwill and not maniacal, world-conquering, or human-hating sort of insectoid weirdness, as we sometimes see in the technological space. We sometimes see people that just clearly have distaste for humanity and human consciousness. And Musk doesn't have that. He actually values human consciousness very deeply and has spent a lot of effort trying to think about how to preserve it in the future as technological advance rapidly increases, especially when it comes to digital stuff and this kind of thing. And so Neuralink is an attempt to do that. And when we're looking at it, we should think about it in that way and ask, what promise does it hold? What are some of the blind spots that Musk has? Because I think he does have major blind spots, which I'm going to get into. And more broadly, stepping aside from Elon Musk for a second and thinking about this hyper-technological age that we're in, it's obvious, I think, that we have a sick philosophy at work that is very pervasive and that many of our technologists, maybe not Musk doesn't hold this view entirely, but it's very pervasive among kind of the so-called thought leaders of this technological age. This sick philosophy that the world is just a machine, that we are just objects in a collection of objects, and everything that makes us distinctive as human beings is actually an illusion or an accident or a trick of the mind. This is a very old concept. This is one of the parts of our moment that is not actually as new and unprecedented as it seems. It goes back at least to Democritus and Leucippus, the early ancient atomists whom I've talked about on the show. And Democritus is quoted as having said that human experience, touch and taste and sound and these sorts of things is mere convention. It's the surface of things, and underneath it is matter in motion. This is a philosophically incoherent view, and it also leads you to a kind of helplessness where all you can do is await the coming of something that will obliterate humanity, some new machine that will wipe us off the map. And because of that, because that philosophy is in the air, because it's pervasive and evil, and we know in our hearts that it's not true, that our experience isn't an illusion, everybody's a little bit on edge. Everybody is casting about for some alternative to that annihilation, to that end of humanity. And many options are on the table, a lot of candidates in the marketplace, a lot of products you can choose from. There's a revival of Stoicism going on. There is, of course, a strong Christian argument against the annihilation of humanity. There are all sorts of ideas and threads of the tradition that are kind of available, but no one that has really emerged, I think, that people can cling to and say, yes, this will be a bulwark against anti-humanism. Even wokeness is one of those kind of market options that a lot of people are betting on, right? We're going to just dig down into our racial identity or our community, so-called, or our sexual identity, and that's going to be what makes us unique and keeps us alive in the face of this rapid technological advance. And I've often said that wokeness is a kind of counterfeit Christianity or an alternative Christianity. I think in this sense, it definitely is an alternative option that people are trying to grab onto to avoid a world in which our humanity is swept away like an illusion, like smoke, in this kind of Democritean or Epicurean fizz that we just evaporate like ghosts. And what this creates is a situation in which every new technological innovation or thought or idea or potential for change that comes along, unlike in, say, the 90s when we were all very excited and optimistic about the future and the internet and all this stuff, everything instead comes along with this aura of dread, right? It's like somebody builds this chatbot that can process language and pretend to be a human and deliver answers or write funny poetry or help you with your supply chain problems or whatever. And the first thing we start thinking is it's going to break our bodies down and use the aluminum in us for paper clips. Like, that's where our headspace is kind of at, because we can't really see a viable, workable alternative collectively as a species. We don't feel like we have this viable alternative to the anti-human Democritean idea that we are a transitory phase on this grand evolutionary chain that's leading us ultimately toward machinery and perfection of efficiency and that sort of thing. So that's the reason, I think, for all this anxiety, this technological anxiety in the air. And it follows directly from that when something like Neuralink comes up, our first reaction is to ask in a maximally high stakes way, is it good or bad? Will it destroy us or will it save us? And you get kind of maximal versions of each of those for Neuralink, for example, right? When somebody puts a chip in a brain and says, now you can move a cursor with your mind, which is what they're saying they can now do, or that they have one patient who can do at Neuralink. The first reaction you get is, this is the beginning of cyborg humanity. It's the beginning of an apocalypse that will end with the mark of the beast, and you're going to have to get the QR code stamped on your forehead or be executed. That's the bad version, the morally bad version. And then there is this is going to make the blind see and the lame walk, and anybody that opposes it or has any reservations about it at all is a mere Luddite that will be trampled over, steamrolled over by the grand advance of history. And this is actually our salvation. It's not the apocalypse, it's not our destruction, it's actually the second coming in some profound way. And we all want to make these moral judgments, and we leap out like 10, 20, 30,000 years in the future. And one reason I think why we want to do that is because we want to be judged well by posterity, right? Conservatives want to register their kind of lone voice crying in the wilderness against the eventual disaster. We want to be on the side of those that don't take the mark of the beast. And so we're constantly spinning out disaster scenarios and identifying philosophical structural problems, which there really are, which I do believe in, that do exist. We're identifying problems with this technology and all of that because we're afraid that we're going to end up basically just capitulating. We're going to end up as collaborators or complicit in what turns out to be the next great human disaster of the 21st century. And then liberals, on the other hand, want to be judged as, or progressives, you might say, want to be judged as the optimists who looked with great vision into the future, the innovative visionaries who shoved off all of this hidebound traditionalism, just like Galileo and the pioneers of the scientific revolution. We were in favor, the liberals want to say, of change and moving forward, and progress. And they therefore want to be kind of like marked down in the catalog of history as the Galileos and the pioneers and the explorers. And one reason why this anxiety is so intense is because one thing we do in our culture all the time is we judge our ancestors for moral deficiencies that they never could have predicted, that they didn't realize they had. We'll say, oh, they held slaves at a time when slavery was sort of ubiquitous and everybody assumed that it was a necessary evil or was the way of the world or what have you. And then we say, therefore, our ancestors were evil. They were on the wrong side of history. We condemn them. And implicit in that, even if we don't say it outright, is, why should our descendants have any more charity toward us? And so it becomes this desperate, frantic game to preserve yourself against, as the psalmist says in the Psalms, cleanse me of hidden faults, right? Preserve me against the possibility that my children's children are going to look back in horror at the way I ate meat or the chip I put in my brain or whatever. And we are reasoning in retrospect in this way. We are looking forward to our descendants, imagining that they will be as uncharitable as we are, and trying desperately to avoid their censure. And what I want to propose to you at the outset of what is now going to be a series of episodes on Neuralink and these sorts of questions is, this is not an effective way of reasoning. It's not a good mode to try to tell history in retrospect from the standpoint of the future and then be on the right side of it in the present. one reason, of course, is that we don't know what's going to happen in the future. And the other reason is that there is no safe option. The point of that psalm, "Cleanse me of hidden faults," is that only God, from his standpoint outside of history, in the divine eternity, can see your hidden faults. Otherwise, they are by necessity hidden. You are a limited creature. Your brain cannot comprehend everything because your brain is part of everything. And so there are going to be things that, as we discover new information, as circumstances change, as the world develops, there are going to be things that our descendants look back on and say they were wrong about that. And there's no escaping that. There's no escaping it either by maximal pessimism, by saying, don't change anything, be careful, never move, never change. And there's no escaping it by maximal optimism either, by saying everything that progresses us is good and we should favor change over everything else. Both of those are failures as moral frameworks. They don't actually move the ball forward, and they don't accomplish what they're implicitly, secretly designed to do, which is protect you against future condemnation. And let me tell you why that is before I move on, because this is an important point about all this reasoning when we ask about technology. When you say, don't change anything, don't mess with people's brains, don't mess with computer chips in people's heads, this is all bad, virtual reality, all bad. When you say that, you think that you're preserving yourself against the risk of doing something that it would be really catastrophic and disastrous and Faustian, that would be a deal with the devil. And there have been warnings of that kind throughout all of history. That too is a perennial. And anytime there's a new technology, there's a warning that this is going to become a kind of satanic, diabolical bargain. And often those warnings have a lot of truth to them. But if you stop there, if that's the only thing you have to say about technology, then you incur another major moral risk, which is that there's going to be some technology that does actually feed millions, right? Think about the Industrial Revolution or the development of techniques for drawing nitrogen fertilizers out of the atmosphere, out of air. And if you leave those on the table out of fear that you're going to make a deal with the devil, then you leave millions of people unfed who could be fed. You stand in the way of some innovation that's going to literally give sight to the blind, literally do these things that Jesus did and then said we would do more of even than him in his name, right? And so there is an element of human progress, not even just technological change, that is actually a commandment. And if you fail to execute on that, then you end up like the guy who hides his talents in that parable, right? The parable of the talents, you have these resources, this wealth, this silver or gold, and you hide it away. And then the master comes and says, what interest have you delivered on my talents? And you say, nothing, I kept it. I folded it up in a napkin and buried it and hid it away. And you're not going to be judged well for that in posterity or in eternity, right? That's not actually a good approach, and it exposes you to all of this other moral risk. On the other hand, of course, the reality of the deal with the devil fear is obvious. We do have all of these terrible consequences that might unfold. The Dr. Faust's story of the guy that just wants knowledge and power and wants to manipulate the universe and ends up in hell, that's real. And we see examples and possibilities of how that could go forward also with our technology. One of my favorite examples of this is from the First World War. And it's from a guy named Fritz Haber, who was a German chemist studying the composition of the atmosphere. And one of his techniques that he helped to develop was, in fact, to create nitrogen fertilizer, to feed untold numbers of people. And they called him the man who pulled bread from the air because he increased the productivity of crop farming massively with this technique. And with basically the same technique of extracting different chemicals from the air, Haber was able to aid in the production of lethal gases that were used in the trenches in the First World War and are remembered now as one of the signal atrocities of that time. And so every new technological development, which is really a form of material power over the material world, over nature, every new technological development is not morally neutral because everything we do with it has moral valence, is matters morally, but it is morally ambiguous. That is to say, it can be directed in multiple different ways, and our use of it is going to be determined by some higher standard than just what we can do, but it's also going to be necessitated by some higher standard than what we must not do. So we can't live in fear of technological progress, but we also can't live in blind obedience to technology as God. And that leaves us in this scary middle space where we have to find some way of thinking through how to regard all of these developments and changes and what our relationship to nature actually is. I saw recently, I have these friends that run an institution called Ralston College, and they have this incredible, it looks incredible. I would like to kind of do it myself, this MA in the humanities. And I'll drop a link to this in the show notes as well so you can check it out. But their theme for this coming academic year is nature, is not just nature like, ooh, the environment or grass or whatever, which is kind of a decayed version of the word, but this entire formal and spiritual structure all around us that we are embedded in and we have to figure out how to relate to. That's their subject. Looks like a great course. They go to like Greece, and then they do courses it's in Savannah, Georgia. So actually kind of near me. Maybe I'll go check them out at some point. But anyway, this is a kind of a tangent just to say that is, I think, the exact right subject for the Ralston MA in the humanities to be looking at, because that's what we're up against now, is this question of how do we relate rightly to nature? And the answer is not by trying to avoid getting things wrong for posterity. I mean, we do want to be in the right, of course. We want to act morally. But reasoning ahead to what's going to happen in the future and how our children will judge us, whether we were on the right side of history, what unseen faults we have, I submit that is a bad way of doing moral reasoning. It clouds the judgment rather than clearing the judgment. So instead of looking at Neuralink and instantly asking, is this apocalypse or is this salvation? I would like to take a different approach, which I would like to look at it from the standpoint of the tradition, informed by the tradition, but with an openness to change. I would like to look at it and ask, just what is it? Spiritually, philosophically, metaphysically, what is the nature of this project? And that's what I'm going to be talking about for a little bit here. I'm going to start today, and I think this is a big subject, so it's going to touch on a lot of things, and we will keep going into the next few episodes. But rather than striking a pose for posterity, rather than trying to look as good as possible, again, if we act well now, we will, I think, ultimately be able to acquit ourselves before the judge of history and the judge of all things. I think that can be a good result of moral reasoning, but you don't get there by skipping ahead to the end. You get there by looking now in the present at what's going on and asking about the nature of your current situation. There's a wonderful essay that I don't know if I've mentioned this essay before, and it's only tangentially related, but it actually is kind of relevant. There's an essay by Bernard Knox, the great classicist, called Euripides, the Poet as Prophet. And he talks about the idea that artists and literary artists, especially poets, are thought of as prophets. That the one word in Latin, for example, that is often used to mean poet is vates, which just means prophet. And he says, why should this be? It's not because they have magic powers that enable them to tell the future. It's not because they are some kind of hooded initiate looking into a crystal ball or a weird obsidian mirror or something, and the angels are speaking directly to them. It's actually because poets are the only ones that look clearly at the present, and they see in the present the seeds of the things to come. And that, I think, is what we ought to try to do. If we want to be judged well by posterity, we ought to look as clearly as possible at the present. And that confronts us with a question, and I'm going to use Neuralink to start off thinking about it, but this will touch on other things. What is this thing now? What sort of project does it represent? Where does it come from? How did we get to the point where we were doing this? And where might it therefore be going? How should we regard it? Because this news story about them putting a chip in somebody's brain for the first time and all that. It may turn out to be the moment when human-computer interface became, neural and involved implants. It might turn out to be a flash in the pan. You always have to guard against the potential for hype. But I don't think this concept is going away, because one of the things I want to show you is it's actually a many centuries long project. And even Neuralink isn't the first to put a chip in the brain that can enable you to move a cursor. It seems to have happened for the first time with humans in 2004. What's happening now is that Musk is trying to really kind of quantum leap that technology forward, to kickstart it or give it some gas, because one of his major themes is, we have all this technology, but we've been in decline, which is a choice, and we haven't really been, we've been sort of encrusting ourselves over with all of these deadening regulations, and instead we ought to be rocketing forward into the future. He wants to live in the future. He wants the future to look like the future, and one version of this is he wants chips in people's brains that enable them to use computers. Why? Well, for one thing, you might therefore be able to operate, let's say, a mechanical limb with your brain that would just replace your lost leg or something. You might be able to do all sorts of things that we could imagine would actually be objectively, obviously good in some profound sense. Of course, also, there are all the man-made horrors beyond comprehension to think about, right? If you can move a limb, you can also hijack somebody's limb through Wi-Fi, right? You could, if you've got a chip in your brain that enables you to tell your body how to move, it's inevitably networked to other systems that other people control. So you're handing over control to people that may or may not be the right people to have control over your personal body and your brain, and all this stuff, of course, right, is part of the concern as well. So the technology, the physical kind of objects that we're dealing with here are actually relatively simple to explain and think about. And abstracting away for a second from disaster scenarios, moral questions, what we're talking about here is a little stack that is going to be implanted in the brain of those who choose to have it. And it's got a battery, it's got some chips, and then it's got a coil, or rather a kind of a filament of hyper thin wires that contain electrodes. And these are electrical conductors. So they get electrical impulses, stimulus from your brain, which your brain has. The kind of thing that coincides with thought in the brain is electrical stimulus and electrical charge, and the transfer of electrical charge. This device is designed to receive that electrical charge in the part of your brain that intends to move, or the part rather of your brain where intentions to move are physically manifest. And then the device is supposed to translate those impulses into things like the motion of a cursor across a screen. And we will get back into the matter of translation down the line, because that's a very loaded term that Neuralink themselves use, which is an interesting concept in and of itself. But that's for later. The first thing that I want to say about this idea, this concept of putting a chip in the brain that can move a cursor, is it is magic. Neuralink is magic. And when I say that, I do not mean in the soy face sense of, wow, my gosh, like, OMG, they're doing it's magic, bro. Like, I'm so excited. That is not what I'm talking about. When I say that Neuralink is magic, I mean that as a descriptor. I mean that as a technical term in the philosophical tradition of thinking about science. I'm not using that as a pejorative. I'm not using that to label it as necessarily 100% evil. I'm not using it to celebrate it as the coming of salvation. I'm just saying this is what we mean when we talk about magic. And in fact, that's very explicit in the early scientific revolution. So from very early on in what we think of as the scientific revolution, that is the period kind of after the Middle Ages, from, I would say, really like the 15th century on up into the 18th century, being as broad as possible, as people are developing what we now know of as the scientific method, as they are starting to question the philosophy, the kind of neo-Aristotelian philosophy of the medieval academy, as the wars of religion are unsettling people's sense of divine authority, or rather divine authority as invested in human figures. One of the things that's happening, or has happened, during this time, is that you get the questioning on all sides of which human beings get to arbitrate definitively how to interpret the Bible and what the will of God is. And this, of course, is the Protestant Reformation. It's impossible to separate the Protestant Reformation from the scientific revolution. The two go hand in hand, and one, in some sense, creates the conditions for the other. Because if there is no papal authority that can put the last word on how we should live in light of the existence of Jesus Christ and the divine revelation of Scripture, then you have to seek for some other standard of truth. It raises again, in a new way, an ancient question that was major in Greek philosophy, the question of the criterion, or the standard of truth. What is the touchstone by which we measure truth? And this was a huge point of contention and argument in the Hellenistic schools that proliferated out of Athens after the classical period. It was a major topic of argumentation and discussion, and it was effectively resolved. Not, of course, it was never as simple as I'm making it out to be, but by and large, you can say that there is a period during the medieval era when the question of the criterion is really no longer the major subject of debate. And this is what you might think of if you're familiar with the philosopher Suzanne Langer at all, and just kind of a maybe deep cut or deep bench name. But this is somebody who writes about different keys in which philosophy occurs. That really major shifts in philosophy happen when people start to think of different questions and start to treat different questions as primary. And in periods of great unsettlement, the question of the criterion, how do we know and decide on truth, it become urgent. Then, when there is kind of a stable authority that is able to command both political power and religious or moral authority, the question of the criterion, the question of how do we know truth, is kind of shelved for a while, treated as settled. And so you have to understand that when the Protestant Reformation started to happen, when papal authority started to come under question and church authority more generally started to come under question, then we entered into a new era of philosophy when the question of the standard of truth, how do we know truth, became newly relevant. And I would say that we are still living through that crisis in some deep sense. The reason that we've now ended up at an extreme of that, where we're all saying, oh, what is truth and how can we know truth and relativism, yada, yada, begins in this moment when legitimately and for good reasons people are asking, again, how do we know what the truth is? And it's in the context of that debate that the scientific revolution starts to emerge, because the major philosophers of the scientific revolution, and I'm thinking here about Galileo, I'm thinking about Descartes, I'm going to talk especially now about Francis Bacon. These guys were trying to answer that question, and that's why the scientific method takes shape the way that it does, because this emphasis on experience, empiricism, and experiment, that is, controlled observations designed to answer precise and specific questions, is an attempt to recover a standard, an absolute standard of truth that we can be sure about, that we can rely on. And for Francis Bacon especially, whose career takes place under the auspices of a Protestant king, King James in England, that method, that sort of nuts and bolts, ask a question that can be answered by material observation, and then revise your hypothesis or what you think is going to happen on the basis of that observation, is nothing less than Bacon's proposal for how we replace the authority of the Catholic Church. And it's not simply, oh, I think it would be better, we would get better gadgets if we do things this way. It's much more profound than that. It is a philosophical upheaval, and it's why his most famous work is called the Novum Organon. The Organon is a series of Aristotelian works that in the medieval church was taken as the system for knowing things about metaphysical matters, but also physical matters and nature and so forth. And so when Bacon says, here's my new organon, he's saying this is now how we know things. And in part, that is why, although Bacon himself believed in God, or professed to at least, and although he did have a sort of sophisticated system for thinking about things that were maybe slightly more than material, it's really mostly matter that Bacon is concerned with, because it's matter that subjects itself, he thinks, to this kind of examination. And I want to read to you now from what Bacon has to say about magic, because I think what we're looking at in Elon Musk and Neuralink is really the most advanced version of something Bacon thought we would be able to do, which is what he called good or honorable magic. And I'm referring here to a passage not from the Novum Organon, not from the new handbook of all knowledge, but instead from a book whose English title is Of the Dignity and Advancement of Learning. You will sometimes see it in Latin under De Augmentiis Scientiarum. You might notice, if you're following along at home, that Scientiarum sounds a lot like science. It is at this stage that we begin the journey away from a meaning of science, which just is like, science is just knowledge of all kind, learning of all kind, until eventually in like the 1800s, science, or Wissenschaft, is going to become specifically this kind of knowledge, this material, experimental, observational, quantifiable knowledge. And Bacon is talking about much more than that. He's talking about all forms of knowing, but his emphasis on this kind of empirical, data-driven, observation-level type of knowledge is going to eventually replace spiritual, philosophical, metaphysical knowledge, all the stuff that we now kind of sniff at or look down on as airy-fairy nonsense. And that you can see now why this was, in fact, a revolutionary act, and has had, I would say, some unintended and not entirely salutary consequences. On the other hand, you can also see why it seemed necessary to Bacon, because there was this unsettlement, because there was this questioning and uncertainty about where truth lies, how to know truth. And it's in the work on the advancement of learning, which is written over the course of the early 1600s. Its English version is published in 1605. Then there's a expanded Latin version in 1623, which is the same year that Galileo is writing his Assayer. And it's a big year, a big sort of period for this development that I'm talking about. And Bacon starts talking in book 3, chapter 5, about magic. And he says, look, there's all sorts of things that travel under the name of magic that are obviously bunk, that are obviously quackery, and exactly the sort of thing that I'm trying to shoo away, to get rid of, is this superstition and like chanting over cards and reading tea leaves and all sorts of hocus pocus mumbo jumbo. But, he says, now I'm reading from Bacon directly, it seems requisite that the word magia, accepted for a long time in the worst part, that is usually thought of as this kind of silly hokum, it's necessary that that word be restored to the ancient and honorable sense. Magia, among the Persians, was taken for a sublime sapience and a science of the harmony and consents of universals in nature, so that those 3 Eastern kings which came to adore Christ are styled by the name of Magi. Now, Bacon is here making a point that if you have followed along on Young Heretics, you will already have heard me make. When we talked at Christmas time about the journey of the Magi, I pointed out that the Magi were inheritors of the ancient world's most sophisticated scientific tradition, which we now think of as hocus pocus mumbo jumbo because it involved astrology and all this stuff. But in fact, the Chaldean astronomers of the Babylonian Empire, whose tradition was carried on among the Achaemenid Persians and just managed to trickle its way on into the era of the Parthians and so forth, these guys were research scientists. They were observing and making very careful and detailed measurements of cause and effect, or at least patterns, repeated patterns. When this happens, then this is likely to happen. And because they were wrong about a lot of those details, we think that they weren't scientific. They would say things sometimes like, when a sheep is killed and its liver is black, there will be war. And I'm making that particular one up, but these sorts of things, this is how they would talk. And since that's not actually an absolute or a regular cause and effect, we think, oh, well, they weren't scientific. But, however, they would also say things like, we notice that there are certain stars which change their position each night in the sky, and they change their position actually relative to the other stars, which all stay the same relative to each other, and then they change their position in ways that seem to recur, and so we can predict when they're going to do that next. And they were exactly right about that. Those wandering stars were called the planetae, which in Greek just means wanderers, and those were the planets. So the beginnings of our astronomy are also there in this just magical enterprise, the enterprise of knowing the laws of either cause and effect, or at least the laws of if this, then that, right? That these things follow after one another, the logic and the rhythms of nature. Nature conceived of as a system with a logic that answers to human reason. And what that means is that if you know the logic, then you can start to cast spells, because spells are just changing the cause to get a different effect. That's also what science is. And this is the point that Bacon here, one of the originators of the scientific revolution, is saying. So if you tell me that I'm a quack, you also have to tell Bacon that he's a quack, and that science generally as a project is quackery. But actually, I would say something rather different, which is science is magic that works. And this is what Bacon goes on to say. He said, it is worth the pains to note that in these sciences which hold so much of imagination, like the adulterate magic of which we now speak, alchemy, astronomy, and the like, so the stuff that we now sniff at, right? The means and theory are ever more monstrous than the end and pretenses. He's saying it's not that they're wrong about what they want to do, it's just that they're wrong about how to do it. He goes on, he gives a bunch of examples. The turning of silver or quicksilver or any other metal into gold is a hard thing to believe, yet it is a thing far more probable to a man well skilled and experimented in the natures of weight, yellow color, malleable and extensible, also fixed and violent, and so on he goes. Very interestingly, here's another example that he gives. So the retarding of age, or the restoring of some degree of youth, right? Eternal life, another major objective of many of our technologists, thinking especially right now of Brian Johnson, right? The retarding of age does not easily purchase a belief, yet it is far more likely to a man that knows perfectly the nature of aerefaction and the depredations of the spirits upon the solid parts of the body, and hath thoroughly observed the nature of assimilation, of alimentation, either more perfect or more peccant. She's saying, if you know like rules of nutrition, and if you observe how the biological organism tends to work, you are more likely to achieve the end that all of these cranks are trying to achieve. So it's not that the magicians, the bad magicians, are wrong about what they want to do. It's that they haven't been scientific enough. They haven't isolated cause and effect with clarity and with precision. And so the real magic, says Bacon, is a science which deduceth the knowledge of hidden forms to strange and wonderful effects and operations, and as it is commonly said, by joining actives with passion, deduceth the knowledge of hidden forms to strange and wonderful effects and operations. When you do science to an extent that you can identify how unseen things operate and cause effects in the world, you are doing magic. I would propose that neurochemistry is a perfect example of our latest and most refined version of this kind of magic. That when we look at the brain and we say it operates through electricity, we are invoking an immaterial thing. Electricity, we think of electricity as material, but actually one of the biggest crises in science after Newton is the realization that electromagnetism is actually a transfer of energy and an exertion of force, neither of which, strictly speaking, is an object. And so we think of electricity as an object, but it's really a pattern of change and behavior in objects that moves through objects. This was the great observation of James Clerk Maxwell, but before him, actually, of Michael Faraday, who was kind of obsessed with this and sort of prefigured what would eventually become Einstein's invention of like field mechanics and space-time, and it's kind of amazing. That's a story for another day. But simply to say, when we talk about the brain as a kind of electrical device, typically, because we're dumb, stupid materialists, we think, oh yeah, that just means it's a machine. But actually what it means is it has strange and wonderful operations through unseen mechanics, right? Through things that cannot actually be directly observed, but whose effects can be seen and whose causes therefore can be inferred. And the Baconian approach to this is to say, great, that's a perfect subject for good magic. And in fact, we can talk about what kind of good magic it is. Because in another work, which is Silva Silvarum, which means something like the Grove of Groves, and its English sort of subtitle is A Natural History in 10 Centuries, published posthumously 1626, and the last century, which is just a kind of grouping, like the centuries of Thomas Traherne, century number 10 in Silva Silvarum is about the kinds of magic. You have, for example, action at a distance, which is something that scientists still talk about, although in slightly different terms. Bacon's example is that perception moves at a distance. We're able to see things from afar, and he's asking what's the material medium through which this action occurs. And, more importantly, he talks then about something called fascination. And fascination is the effect of the imagination on the world. We think of fascination, wow, I'm so fascinated by this thing or this concept, but that is a kind of late derivation from this earlier meaning, which is to say the power of the imagination to work in the world. And Bacon is rather skeptical that this can be done. He hears reports about it, he's not sure, but he says this is an area for further study and research. That this kind of magic, which could be a real and normal kind of magic, needs experiments to prove. And here's what he writes. He says, if there be any power in imagination, it is less credible that it should be so incorporeal and immateriate a virtue as to work at great distances or through all mediums upon all bodies, but that the distance must be competent, the medium not adverse, and the body apt and proportionate. He's saying we need to isolate here the physical location of this activity, if there's such a thing as fascination, and we need to think about the physical medium. And the medium is another urgent matter for people that think about electricity. Again, we're going to get to that. But for now, my only point is, if Bacon could see Neuralink, I think he would say, this is scientific fascination. That is to say, this is the magical working of the imagination, the operation of the mind upon bodies through a medium, which is electricity. And by figuring that out, mankind has been able to devise a machine that alters that activity. The way currently the imagination can only do certain things. Like, for instance, if I imagine raising my hand, I can then cause my hand to be raised. I have an internal power over my body. The device, the Neuralink device, is a magical device for extending the power of the imagination further than its current remit through the medium of electricity, or rather through the electrical medium that electricity moves through. None of this is yet to do with morality, whether this is good or bad. It is merely a technical description in the terms not only of our Western tradition, because Bacon was not the first person to think about magic in these terms, but also in the terms that are native to the scientific revolution, that we've kind of lost sight of because they've become so ubiquitous and we've forgotten all this history. But properly speaking, within the tradition of the scientific revolution, Neuralink is magic. It is a device for extending the power of fascination from the mind out into the world via the electrical medium. What does all of this mean? Well, there's one more passage from Bacon that I want to read, and then I want to leave you with some questions that we will pick up again next time. If Neuralink is a magical device, and if I'm right that it is a proposition for doing scientific magic on the power of fascination, then we have to ask what the imagination is. And that's our next question, right? So if I imagine moving, right, and then I move, or if I imagine moving a cursor and then the cursor moves, the question that becomes most urgent for us then is, what is imagination? Because before we start to wield the power, we ought to know what that power is. And imagination, even if the brain is physical, even if electricity is arguably, if not a physical object, then a physical activity, imagination is a psychic power. It's something that we do in response to the world. And Bacon wants to say that it's one of three basic operations of the human mind. And human souls for Bacon are maybe the one thing that's not strictly material, along with God. God is not material, human souls are not material, but they operate through these material actions and act on bodies, corporeal things. And so he says we have three powers of the mind. We have memory, we have imagination, and we have reason. And each one of these produces a different kind of field or activity. Memory produces history, so we remember the things that happened and then we write about them. Imagination produces poetry, and reason produces philosophy. So obviously Bacon is going to be most in favor of philosophy, right? And as I said, he's skeptical about the extent to which imagination can really work. But to really understand what he's doing when he's talking about imagination is you have to know the root of the word. And it's still vaguely there in our English word imagination. What's the root word of imagination? Image, right? To produce an image, which is now when we think about imagining something, like imagine a centaur, right? You picture it in your head. But remotely, that comes from another Greek word, phantasia, which is related to the words for like appearing and manifesting and stuff. And phantasia is all kinds of image producing in the mind, either images of reality or images of fantasy. And so for Aristotle, for example, phantasia is what happens when the mind produces an image of something, whether that thing exists or not. And our more restricted sense of imagination is gradually going to develop out of this Bacon idea that there is something called imagination that's distinct from right reason, that's distinct from all the other stuff. And it consists in cooking up things that do not exist. And we can do this by kind of taking different parts from things that do exist and combining them in our head and so on and so forth. And this activity, speaking very broadly, is poetry, is the making of new things with the imagination. We think of poetry just as words that we say, whatever, but actually it comes from a Greek verb, poiein, to make, to create. And so for Bacon, imagination is the contribution, the innovation that the mind of man can make over and above the world that already exists. Here's what he says. We're back now in De Augmentis, Book 2, Chapter 11. He says, seeing this sensible world is in dignity inferior to the soul of man. Poetry seems to endow human nature with that which history denies. So memory can only teach us what has happened. Poetry teaches us what might be, or what is not, even, and to give satisfaction to the mind with at least the shadow of things where the substance cannot be had. So, on the one hand, this is less substantial, less real, less good than philosophy, which teaches us absolute truths, or memory, which teaches us about history and things that have happened. On the other hand, imagination is where the world becomes better than it is, or maybe could be, or looks that way. And so the idea of taking imagination and making it an active force in the world, if you can do that, for Bacon, would represent one of the most promising avenues of magic. And that's what it represents for Elon Musk, too. Even though he wouldn't use these terms, wouldn't think about it in these ways, Neuralink is an attempt to use imagination to transform the world to be better than it is. And that will be the sell that he makes. He will make that pitch. He's already made that pitch. People will make that pitch for things like Neuralink, for brain-computer interfaces. They will say, this magic will let us create sight where people couldn't previously see. It will let us add limbs to people who don't have limbs. It will enable us to do all of these things. And don't you think those are good things? And shouldn't we not stand in the way? And anyway, isn't it coming? Isn't it just down the line? Here's what I have to say about this. And I'm going to leave you with a moral quandary, and then we're going to delve back into it next week, because I just wanted to lay this out. Magic, famously, is dangerous. Magic opens you up to all sorts of things. And even though what you want is to use magic to exert power over the world, it turns out that magic doesn't just come out, it also goes in. And as I said before, if you put a chip in your brain that enables you to move your legs around, you are also putting a chip in your brain that enables somebody else to command your legs how to move. If you open up the possibility that you can have a limb where you didn't have one but should have. You also open up the possibility that you can have any number of limbs that you never had and no human ever had, that you could create all sorts of strange and perhaps even terrifying things. In fact, that there would be no rules anymore at all. And the only thing restraining human action would be mankind's own moral sensibility, which, as we know, is deeply flawed. And so this is what we're talking about. This is what we're contemplating. This is why we're at such a high fever pitch, is because there are proposals on the table which have always been quite serious and have been for many hundreds of years to do magic, actually, to figure out the right ways of doing magic and the wrong ways. And in that case, all the ancient warnings about magic also apply, that you might be opening yourself up to demonic influence, that you might be taking off guardrails that are supposed to be there. And before you take them away, you have to think about why they were there and how you might do magic rightly and how you might do magic wrongly. So the question is there such a thing, not just as effective magic, magic that works, but good magic, magic that is virtuous? I'm going to propose to you that there might be, that even though there is Dr. Faustus, and even though there are evil sorcerers, there is also Gandalf, and there is also Dumbledore, and there is also Merlin, right? There are also virtuous, or at least potentially virtuous, magicians. And what's awesome about this thought is that it enables us not just to be thinking about what kind of tech we can build, but also to use the vast wealth and resources of literature and medieval thought about magic and storytelling and imagination to bring to bear a genuinely new way of morally reasoning about what we're doing in the here and now. So I'm excited about that. I hope you are too. We're going to be talking about magicians, good and bad, in literature going forward as we start to think about technology. That's it for now on this episode. Let's take a mailbag question. Mailbag questions come to me through Substack. Substack is increasingly an important place for you and me to be in contact. I run my own personal Substack. It's called Rejoice Evermore, and I will link to that as well in the notes, rejoiceevermore.substack.com. I also have a joint Substack with my father, Andrew Clavin, called The New Jerusalem, where we talk a lot about the stuff that this episode was about. So if you like these kinds of topics, go check out our ongoing literary exchange there at thenewjerusalem.substack.com. You can support us financially at both of those places, but you can also sign up for free, and this is the way that you can get in touch with me and ask me mailbag questions. So here's one from Sox Nation. A really interesting question. He says, since you missed the Super Bowl, you also missed, from what I can see, the hubbub about the Jesus Gets Us ad. So yeah, I was in Cambodia, I was on vacation when this ad aired. I saw that it caused a Twitter stir, but didn't really delve in. I didn't wade in, but now I'm being asked to. As you know, that organization has been running ads like that for at least a season, if not longer. Yeah, these have been around for a while. This was a particularly glitzy version, and it was a bunch of images of people washing each other's feet, the way that Jesus washed his disciples' feet. And the program is basically, Jesus is not your enemy. He's not condemning you for this or that political reason, but actually his love crosses all these boundaries that we set up between each other, and he'll meet you where you are. You might be a blue-haired liberal, you might be gay, you might be trans, you might be an illegal immigrant, all of these things. Jesus is still there for you. So there was a lot of fighting about this. Mostly I saw negative comments from conservatives. I saw some qualified defense. I think Michael Knowles said, look, if this gets one lib to maybe think positively about Jesus or have positive associations, then maybe it's a good first step, whatever. But then the Babylon Bee made this really funny response, which was about Satan. Satan gets us, right? Satan wants us never to change, just as we are, takes us in our obesity, in our sin, in our violence, just loves us. Satan wants to spend eternity with you. So that was a funny response, and I think that kind of highlights what people's concern is here. Let me say what my concern is, because I didn't really like the ad. There's a concept in here that I do like, but I don't think this ad really did it. And the reason that this raised people's hackles, in my opinion, is as follows. There's one scene where there's a Martha's Vineyard mom washing an illegal immigrant's feet, and the scenes all tend to go in that direction. It's always the sort of so-called marginalized class, the victim class that's getting washed by the traditionalists. So you'll have like a gay guy getting washed by a Catholic priest or so forth. These people in positions of so-called traditional authority, kneeling and washing the feet of so-called marginalized groups or outcasts or victims. What there isn't so much of is relationships that go the other way around. And I would suggest that that would be really provocative. In 2024, nobody is shocked to see an image of a Catholic priest washing a gay guy's feet. That stuff actually happens. In 2024, what would be really shocking would be to see a gay guy washing a Catholic priest's feet. And that hints at my problem with this, which is that it presents itself as a good message, which is Jesus loves everybody, no matter what. But the examples all go in one way. And so the impression that you come away with is that Jesus loving everybody cashes out in terms of a particular political program and a particular set of views. And it suspiciously looks like following this Jesus foot washer guy doesn't require you to change any of your comfortable liberal assumptions about voting Democrat. And that always strikes me as off, because if you really were trying to get the point across that Jesus crosses all political boundaries, you would be much more specific about like the MAGA person, the Trump hat wearer getting his feet washed and all this stuff. And instead, there's just a vibe. It's not like, this is an exclusive rule for how this works. It's just people can smell this at this point. And this is what set people off. There's a vibe that really bothers me too. It has a kind of I'm not saying, I'm just saying, right? Like, I'm really just showing you what Jesus did. Jesus washed feet. But the undercurrent is always, and so you should probably not be in favor of immigration restrictions, right? You should probably open the border. And my feeling about that is if you want to make an argument that Jesus' life and teachings require certain political stances or activities, go ahead and make that argument. I'm open to that argument, but make it in political logical terms. Present that argument to me. I think there is legitimate debate to be had over what a Christian policy looks like at the border. I would make the case that lawlessness and the dissolution of the American nation is actually not loving to neighbor or even to the people that you let in. It's a sort of separate issue. But we could have that argument. We could say, well, Jesus said this and therefore we should do that. Jesus said this and therefore we should do that. But it's a little manipulative to effectively make that argument while pretending to just make this kind of lovey-dovey, touchy-feely, Jesus was great statement. There is a good version of this, and I actually think you could do that. I don't think that this ad really got there, but you could say, I'm genuinely not making any claims about the political implications of Jesus' teachings. There may be such implications, but we will discuss them at a future time. For now, I'm trying to establish the first point by performing a kind of prophetic act, which is a shocking demonstration of servant love. And what that says is, yes, God does actually have ideas about how we should live. But first, he approaches us. He doesn't wait for the differences between us to be resolved before he comes to us and lavishes love upon us. And so we must go and do likewise. There are all sorts of differences between us that are real and need discussing about immigration, about sexual politics and morality, that sort of thing. But the Christian thing to do, you might say, is first make an act of love. Then, from that starting standpoint, try to resolve or reason those differences. Yes, we still have those differences. Yes, we still have to talk about them. But by washing your feet, I'm showing how God approaches the world. He comes to us before those differences are resolved. And that's what I'm going to do too. I'm going to lavish you with love, treat you as highly favored and precious in my sight. And then from there, as a starting point, we're going to try to resolve our differences, rather than the way the world typically works, which is we have to resolve our differences before we can love each other. That is, I think, a prophetic and Christly message. But I don't really think that that's what this ad was doing. I think that ad was pretending to say that while secretly saying, and once you get to the other side of that, you're still going to be right about all your blue-haired liberal politics. Just my take. That's what I think. I'm could be wrong about this particular ad, but it struck me as sus, and that is why. All right, that's it from me. I will put links in the show notes to all of the stuff that I've talked about, the book, the Ralston College MA program, the 2 Substacks, all those goodies. Check them out. And please do subscribe. This really helps me to just build the show. And I love doing this. If you can't tell, I love talking to you guys. And I want to keep doing it all the time, as much as possible. The more people we get on board, the better. So share, give us 5 stars, do all that jazz, subscribe so you don't miss an episode. But most of all, stay with me, because I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.